When we talk about datafied methods, we're not simply talking about techniques that use data. Humans have always used data of one sort or another. What we really are talking about is a much deeper historical process called datafication, the transformation of observations, activities, and relationships into a standardized, manipulable representation that can be stored, compared, and exchanged. This is not a modern phenomenon, it's ancient, but it's accelerated drastically in the last 2 or 3 decades. That acceleration has reshaped how we study the world, how institutions govern, how businesses run, and how knowledge itself is shaped and reshaped. So to understand datafied methods, we need to step back into the Wayback Machine for just a minute and talk a little bit about the history of datafication. One of the earliest and clearest examples of datafication came during a period starting around 8,000 years ago and running to about 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the sort of breadbasket of society, a heavily agrarian society that was rapidly growing and rapidly increasing their stocks at the time, their capital. The word capital has the same root as cattle, and so literally this was livestock, this was wheat, this was goods that were eventually things like salt. It's eventually what we call secondary agricultural products, right? And the problem is that, wheat spoils, herds move, land is uneven. These are not naturally discrete objects. These are not things where you can describe it in language. You could count heads of cattle, but it's not an obvious way to do things. And the solution was an elegant one. And initially, when we found the physical evidence of this, people weren't quite sure what it could be, but over time it's become clear that clay tokens, marked in various ways, became small, standardized objects, and they could be used to represent quantities of goods. Now, we have other evidence of ways in which different societies have made use of technology to record quantities, right? So we've had tally sticks. Tally sticks, I think the earliest tally stick we now know of is 120,000 years old. Like at the beginning of where we started to think of humans as humans, people were using bones with tally sticks on them. It's really hard to guess how they were using them at that earliest stage, but since they continue to be used in almost every human civilization kind of throughout history, we can guess, right? The more extreme kind of end of this is the use of quipu, and we've probably talked about this elsewhere, but these necklaces of woven ropes that were used for accounting in the New World. But various forms of this existed everywhere. The case of the clay tokens are interesting because they're the first form of cuneiform writing, and so really the birth of written language in many ways. And so that's how they were first seen. But the interesting piece of this is really that process of datafications. They took this, it took clay, it's formed clay itself into a token that allowed for these kinds of messy physical realities to be represented in a standardized way. So you could carry your wealth in your pocket for the first time and go to a trading place where you didn't have to bring your entire flock of whatever or your entire land holdings or wheat that's being stored somewhere. You could go somewhere and exchange and present and sell these things in such a way that it allowed for the first sort of specialization. And again, as I said, the building of secondary goods from these, and really the birth of civilization, of one of the many births of civilization, but the one that has driven a great deal of civilization, especially in the Western world. This is kind of datafication in its very earliest form. And the system didn't just enable trade, it gave rise to, I would say, not just trade and not just writing, but and not just accounting, right? Because accounting precedes literature in some ways. But really the birth of data. And so to that extent, to say that we have suddenly datafied social life or social science would be wrong. In fact, you might even argue the other way around, which is data preceded society, at least as we know it. In many ways, most of what we think of as being a social system, institutions, trade, exchange, written language, a lot of this came out of the process of early datafication. Now, we could go and talk about, I think this is a pretty clear example for me. We could talk about, as I said, the quipu in the Andes. We could talk about tally sticks in various places. I should do a sales pitch here for my book, we talk about this a little bit in my book, as an introduction to the idea of datafication. But let's pause for a minute and really talk about what we mean by datafication. We've said it here, but let's be more explicit, and that is, datafication is the structured process of modeling and representing the world in ways that are open to interoperability, comparison, counting, archiving, and exchange. So So it's not just measurement, although measurement is a piece of datafication. It's standardization. It's the creation of categories that can travel across time, across institutions, across systems. There's some fairly famous ethnographic work about the use of tokens for people exchanging with very long kind of symbolic exchanges throughout the South Pacific, for example. So that, these, in this case, things like shells and that sort of thing formed a gift economy that allowed for exchange that crossed languages, crossed cultures in a really important way. Once created, these representations, however, tend to take on a life of their own. You'll probably hear this over and over again. The data don't tell you anything. The data do not speak. But we do tend to lead towards a reification of that data, and it tends to start to embody its own power over time. Which brings us to Doomsday. The Doomsday Book, I think, is a really marked period of the first large-scale social database, and it's not new. We're still a millennia back, right? A millennia back. It was commissioned in 1086 by William the Conqueror, because you can't be called William the Conqueror if you don't know what it is you've conquered. It was an extraordinary administrative undertaking. It sought to catalog nearly every piece of land in England, including who owned it, how much it was worth, what resources it contained, who lived on it, what obligations were owned, what it produced. And, at a prosaic level, I guess you could say William was trying to figure out who owed him taxes, right? But it was more than that. And it ended up becoming not just a record, but really an assertion of authority. The original Doomsday Book has been used in legal cases in England for a millennium, because it really kind of detailed where those borders were for the very first time. So in some ways it was kind of the first, not just the first kind of record of where things were, but the first drawing of borders between both administrative districts and also sort of ownership, who owned what plots of land. This kind of standardization led to power through that authority. You had standardization of what constituted a household, what constituted ownership of something, of land, of the types of classes of citizens. So to make this book, you actually had to both first choose what language you're going to use, because William the Conqueror is coming in French, and then what script you're going to use. They had to pick a script that was easily legible by a fairly wide group of people, and standardize that across scribes. It took thousands of sheep to make the actual vellum to record this on. And then you had to come up with some kind of set of standardized codes. So there's actually little codes that they've used to tag different parts of the things they're trying to record. And that meant that, even though there are, I don't know how many, because this is so outside of our realm, but if you look, there are several different forms of peasant at the time, but you had to standardize that across the entirety of England and sections of Wales. And so you had to kind of have a way of being very clear about what counted for what and how you were going to decide that. And then when you sent people out to go and do these surveys, you had to tell them, okay, how do you code this? What are there's actual, the Doomsday Book itself is one piece. And then there is a second piece, which is the code book for the Doomsday Book, which was the set of instructions for what people were supposed to do with this when they went out to go out and ask people questions about who owned what and whatever. They had to have a set of standardized questions and a standardized way of coding it to bring that data back and then have it inscribed in the Doomsday Book. So it's not just, it didn't just kind of reflect existing power, but concentrating this into an actual physical object that recorded what was true about an entire country. It produced power. It produced an object of power. It became effectively unquestionable. There were no other authorities. It was its claim to totality of the entire, it was the data. This was the truth written in a single book. That's how it ended up being named this, because it was kind of the end of all books. It was the one that recorded all of the power. This is a recurring theme in datafication, that once something is rendered as data, it becomes legible to institutions and therefore governable, but also therefore the means of governing. And this seems episodic, but obviously between the tokens and then the Doomsday Book, 7,000 years later and today, we have lots of different forms of datafication, but it tends to proceed slowly. During the Industrial Revolution, we had a bit of an acceleration as we had really exciting innovations in things like vertical filing, and that is not sarcasm. Vertical filing was a huge breakthrough. Things like the printing press, obviously, and things like carbon paper, all of these small innovations in handling data happened. We had a period of 7,000 years between the tokens and the Doomsday Book, and then we had the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and we just had this massive increase. And then, of course, we made the move from these huge banks of vertical files to the first large computers used by the government, then used by the insurance industry, and then used by others to record information about often people. In other words, these were social databases, right? And these moved from being on physical on paper, basically. By the time we get into the Industrial Revolution, almost all of this is produced onto paper, including computer programs, right? The computer programs all the way up through when I was an early computer programmer, you could still find people punching cards, putting the programs on paper. So all of this was paper-based, but especially during the 1970s, and then certainly into the 80s and 90s and the rise of the PC, the personal computer, and its business use, you had this move from paper to disk drives. This was a huge acceleration. The paper itself was an acceleration, and then the move to disk drives was an acceleration. It was this move to binary, right? It replaces file cabinets with a very standardized form of being able to record data. It's not just the binary, it's also the schema that you can store things in files with, and the ways in which you can replace ledgers, and the rise of systems for allowing for, obviously for spreadsheets and things like that. So it's applications and data structures that are standardized. And then you make another move. Once you have these all standardized, you no longer have to sort them ahead of time, right? The sorting matters less than being able to index them and search them. Data becomes cheaper and cheaper to store, easier to duplicate, and far, far faster to process. So these constraints that once shaped the collection of observations into standardized form begin to dissolve. That is, we make that move to things that are less and less difficult to instantiate as data. The datafication process itself has sped up to the degree that it is almost invisible. So invisible that it is dangerously so in some cases. But it's worth remembering, now that we move from the very large to the question of particularly methods, how recent this transformation is, right? Until very recently, social data was very scarce. Even into the late 20th century, researchers worked in what might be called like a desert of social data. If you wanted to, the hardest part of doing social research was getting at the data. You may know the foundational work of Katz and Lazarsfeld, who came up with this theory of two-step flow and then multi-step flow, this idea of opinion leaders, right? That people generally didn't get their ideas about voting or about the movies or about fashion from the television or from the newspaper or magazines. They got it from an opinion leader within their personal network, right? And that work was started in the late 1940s and went through for over a period of a couple decades. But, to get that data, Katz and Lazarsfeld, starting with Erie, Ohio, Erie County in Ohio, sent out like an army of graduate students to go out and literally go and knock on people's doors and sit on their couches and ask them questions from a survey. This was how that work got done. It cost enormous amounts of money to collect this data. It wasn't just sitting there. There was no way to kind of gather it other than literally going and asking people the question. And in that case, it was panel data initially from a sample of 2,400, as I recall, and then a panel of 600 people who were informants for their families, so I guess 600 families, where they had to go back because it's panel data every few weeks in some cases, and then every few months and every few years, where they went back and asked these questions again. And so this employed an army of, as a graduate student, you might like the idea of employing an army of graduate students, but in order to collect any kind of data, you had to go out and ask people. It was not just sitting there to be collected, right? That has been the standard and has continued to be the standard. Even when the data was already recorded, my mother is a historian and did her graduate work looking at records of kind of births, deaths, and marriages. But to do that, she had to go and kind of make friends with nuns in rural Spain and kind of go and live in a nunnery and talk to them until they finally trusted her enough to show her these records. And then she had to kind of work through these physical books. So, even when the data was already collected, getting access to it could be extraordinarily difficult. In some ways, that may not have changed with the digital, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So datafication was certainly possible before computers. It happened. It had to happen. And for researchers, it was a large part of what we did. In this same class we're taking right now, the task that was given to me, not the same class, but when I was a graduate student, back in the olden days, back in the days when we had a computer lab with a few PCs and that was the best we could do, right? So back in the olden days, in this class, one of your tasks would be to go, I went to university did my doctoral work at the University of Washington. And our job was to go to the two places you could get people to talk to you, which was spending the day in the courthouse with people waiting for jury service. That was one choice. And the other choice was to go and ride the ferries back and forth. Because the idea was that people in these two conditions were bored enough to answer your survey questions. That's how you got them to answer your survey questions. This would not make sense for me to give you as an assignment today, because who knows what people would do to you if you went up to them and asked if you could ask them some questions. It was hard enough as it was, but it was kind of learning to be a social researcher meant knowing how to approach people with a clipboard in your hand and get them to take, $2 from you to talk to them about their choice in magazines, or how they felt about air travel or whatever, right? And so that was what you were expected to do as a social scientist. And a large part of that has changed radically over the last couple of decades, basically. Part of this is because so much of what we have today is born digital. The situation is kind of inverted. We have so much data, we don't know what to do with it all. Communication, commerce, mobility, social interaction, all produce what we call trace data, data as a byproduct, that is in many cases just there for the picking. In some cases now, people recognize the value of it, but it's often just sitting there, already digitized. One of my other projects as an undergraduate was for a UN conference, the first UN conference on the environment. And, a big part of what we had to do was sit there and scan physical documents, taking physical documents and scanning them electronically so that there was some record of them beyond the paper, with the thought that, strangely at the time, that this new revolution in the digital world would lead to more ecologically sound processes. I'll leave that one to marinate for a minute. But the idea was we would come in with a box of paper of all these documents in all of the standard languages for the United Nations, and we would scan them in one by one, and then we would check them to see whether they could be scanned and whether they could be recognized, OCR'd. Now, obviously, those documents would not be typed. They would start off digital. So that makes no sense at all. One of my jobs back when I was in graduate school was working in a city office. And my boss would have his secretary, this is a job that used to exist, a personal secretary, would have his secretary print his emails so he could read them. And then he would reply to them by writing out his reply. And she would be charged with typing out an email reply. Printing an email now, used to be you would print tickets, right? Instead of just having them on your phone. Even to me, that now seems slightly archaic. I still do it when I fly because I don't trust my phone, but for all kind of like for concert tickets and stuff, why would I print it? Doesn't make any sense, right? So email now seems slightly eccentric. How often do you have to print something? You don't have to print it to turn it in at a university, which used to be one of the trailing things. Basically things start digital and they end digital, and hopefully they're archived in a way that they don't disappear, right? This shift fundamentally alters research. Instead of creating data, we're often kind of encountering it. Instead of sampling, because we have to, we can often collect the entire universe of data, the entire population. A lot of my work early on was doing this, instead of saying I'm going to collect a statistically significant sample of, say, 1,200 out of a universe of 1,000, that doesn't make sense, out of a universe of 100,000 or a million, I would, because especially when I was using network approaches, I would collect it all. And, it was funny because, and a lot of people who did work that was methodologically similar to me ran into the same thing. They would put it into a journal and the referee would say, why aren't you reporting p-values? P-values are necessary when you're sampling, but a lot of what we do is no longer sampling. We don't have to sample because we can get the whole thing. Why would we sample if we have it all? This has shifted also what we do with that data once we have it. Running averages and then trying to figure out how an average set of data might reflect, or we might be able to infer the larger group from that, doesn't make as much sense anymore. Instead of looking for the general sense of the haystack, we start to think about whether there are needles that are more interesting within that data. So the whole idea of sampling has kind of changed significantly. And that's just one of the many changes that have happened. I think that, I suspect if you are teaching this same class in 30 or 40 years, the question of whether you really need to even deal with sample-based inference as a standard kind of methodology will be in question, right? It may still be useful for things like, voting surveys, right? For politics and things like that. But outside of that, it may not be very widely used. This sort of embarrassment of riches comes with its own challenges, of course. Often we'll talk about big data and big data as the big boon, and it is a big boon. I don't want to dismiss that, and I think it's easy. I'm going to ask you to read something that does talk about some of these problems in a little more depth, but it is a huge advantage. It's hard to convey just how nice it is to be able to decide from data that's just sitting there. It's kind of like being able to walk down a street and pick an orange off the tree. It's just there and available to you. But it gives rise to new kinds of problems that social scientists haven't had to deal with in the past. And this is usually kind of characterized as big data. Big data is a marketing term by people who build databases. I'm not joking. It's the whole definition of big data is generally data that's hard to deal with, right? So the big data that social scientists deal with are tiny compared to the collections of data that, say, people doing large-scale astronomy or high-speed physics or something like that. They're dealing with data that dwarfs ours in terms of the production of total content, right? Nonetheless, the whole idea of big data is that it is so big that it is hard to do stuff with. When I did my own dissertation, the collection of the data, even though it was all digital, I was scraping from the web, took well over 3 months. The actual attempt to do a large-scale network analysis, something that now actually I could do on my laptop very, very easily, again, took a great deal, a significant amount of working through new kinds of algorithms, only to then spend 6 weeks of cranking through that data to find that it failed and trying again. And like, so I did not expect, starting in a social sciences program, that I would have to learn to program. I did not, because most of my colleagues did not. I didn't expect, and I actually knew how to program before, but that I would need to kind of dive in to the extent that I did. I didn't expect that I'd have to talk to people about, sending large arrays of disk drives in order to transfer data from San Francisco up to me in Seattle. These were not things that I expected. And so a lot of what defines big data is the stuff you have to do that you're not expecting to do. One of these definitions talks about the 4 V's of big data. The volume, it's just a lot of stuff. It costs a lot of money to save and hold this data and to archive it. The velocity, it comes at you very quickly. I mean, this is a great advantage that we could do kind of real-time social science, something that we never really thought we could do. This was limited to kind of governments and businesses, but since the governments and businesses are doing this electronically, we can tap into that in some cases, or generate our own feeds to kind of do data observatories and be able to get this data rapidly. But it also means we have to be able to process it quickly and make sense of it quickly. Variety. So, we've had databases for a long time. Often these were large collections from social surveys, for example, or census data, for example. But these are very different from collecting data from the web, and that the variety talks not just about the differences in kinds of data, but that this is often all mixed together. Databases used to have basically databases of numbers, and sometimes those numbers represented categories, but that's about as complicated as you got. Now those databases can contain images and audio files and streams. And so it's a highly heterogeneous collection of different things that we're kind of trying to make sense of at the same time. Yes, datafication is essentially that process of bringing those down to something that is comparable, right? But often those collections don't start out comparable. So even though they're digital, they may not be in the format that we need to wrangle them into in order to use. And veracity, because we have a lot of data out there, but it's not always clear that it's true, and although things like blockchain are trying to provide some framework for allowing for this, often it's not clear where it came from. So this is the question of sort of the provenance of that data. I mean, we have a lawsuit right now of people who are book authors, and I guess I've been included in that yet. I don't know if I'm getting a check from the settlement, but because the major LLMs, many of them were trained on pirated books, that when you interact with ChatGPT, you're actually interacting with my book, but you don't know that, right? You don't, one of any of the books that I published, or my papers as well, like my journal articles, those got fed in as part of the training data. So you're getting some of that through a very, very dark mirror, right? You won't get any single sentence from anything that I've written, but a lot of the ideas are getting kind of pushed through that. So where did that data come from? Especially when it gets passed from person to person, from organization to organization or system to system, you're not really sure where it's coming from. And so it's really hard to figure out what's good data. Veracity is bad. He chose it because it's another V, but what's good data, where that data comes from, what its source is, it can be very difficult to determine that. Now, on one hand, it's kind of strange that our course has the word computational in it at all, because pretty much any kind of social or behavioral science today has to deal with these issues of big data collections. And large-scale data raises pretty profound methodological and ethical challenges. Who's represented? Who is invisible? Who controls access? How do algorithmic systems amplify historical biases? Or corporate biases? How does disinformation enter into the algorithmic process? What does it mean to analyze behavior that people did not knowingly offer for research? This gets very much into that ethical question of both the role of the subject in the research process and of the question of when trace data is useful data and when it's just low-hanging fruit, and how that might poison our entire research process. So, there are a number of scholars who argue that data abundance does not eliminate the need for careful reasoning. It actually intensifies that need. It requires us to think more seriously about the questions of ethics and methods than we have in the past. I don't want to say it was easy in the past, but there was a clear pathway if you were going to engage in, say, large-scale survey research, or if you were going to look at questions of demographics. You had decades of people slowly changing and adapting the approaches they took, and a general consensus around what methods worked. Now it requires more careful analysis, it requires more technical expertise, and it requires more thoroughgoing and ongoing ethical contemplation and awareness as you do this work. Without theory, and without some historical context in which to put your techniques into, big data sets can mislead with extraordinary confidence. I think we've seen this quite a bit over the last decade or so, where people will take trace data, large collections of data, and it feels like it's compelling because of the size, but there has been a lack of methodological rigor or ethical consideration in the process by which they have arrived at these conclusions. And so even though we are looking mostly at digital kinds of methods here, our focus, a lot of the things that were in existence before, a lot of the same kinds of questions carry through. So we don't get to replace one with the other. It's more of an add a little bit more. I should at least touch on this question of the end of theory, which has come up and I think largely now disappeared again. But this is one of those sorts of things that shows up in a Wired article or elsewhere and gets a lot of attention as a kind of a provocation. The idea here is pretty simple, which is that does that hypothetico-deductive model work when you don't have to hypothesize? When instead of just saying, instead of choosing a research topic, you can say, just show me some patterns in this data, and then you can make sense of that afterwards. In fact, at the very tail end of the course, I may touch on this, some of the thinking I've been doing around this question of kind of forensic methods as an alternative to more traditional theory-based methods. So I don't think that that's entirely bereft of possibilities, but it often is dangerously under-theorized, unsurprisingly, when people do this. They make the assumption that either the process of discovery can be mechanized using AI entirely without needing the use of human abduction or induction, or they believe that in some cases the theory gets in the way of the real discovery, which can be just sort of arrived at through the surfacing of patterns alone. If my tone of voice doesn't give it away, I don't buy into very much of this. I think there are some really interesting possibilities that might involve some questions of mapping or of using mixed methods that might get you towards unexpected discoveries. So I'm not willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I also don't think we should just be sitting in bathwater. I think that we need to think more seriously about the ways in which these new data can be effectively and ethically used to solve problems, as I've said at the very beginning. And so I think when we lose that problem solving question, and when we lose the passion for making the lives of the people around us better, then you start to fall into this question of maybe we just let the computer do the research for us, which is not going to turn out well. What changes isn't the need for theory, it's kind of the role that theory plays. It guides what we ask of data rather than just providing the explanatory framework for it. So, I think if anything, we need new kinds of theory that help us theorize the role of data, not just in society, but also in our research processes. That said, it's kind of, AI is a bit of a specter right now, right? It shows up in unexpected places. I was going to share some data that my high schooler had collected on Google Docs on forums. And it was he'd done a nice little survey when he was in his freshman year. He was looking at a question for his high school has the students do a large project each year. And so he had done a survey and collected, not a huge number of people, but he'd gotten about 85 surveys come back. And so he had some interesting data. He used a form on Google Docs to collect it. And so I was looking at it, and in the interim, now Google Gemini will summarize those results for you and does an interesting job of that. Now, would I use that in my own research process? No. I don't trust it at all. This is putting things into black boxes is already a problem. I am a little bit critical of tools like SPSS that definitely make the process easier, and I don't mind that at all. There's nothing wrong with a tool that makes sort of statistical analysis easier. The problem is that in some cases it can hide pitfalls, and so there's nothing blacker of a box than an LLM, and simply accepting the kinds of summaries that it would give of research data seems incredibly dangerous to me. That said, I am well aware that there are people publishing data that uncritically make use of these kinds of tools. And so I am not saying that we cannot make use of these tools. I am saying that right now it is a very dangerous thing to do. And so it requires a lot more work to use these tools. And at the same time, it's kind of like all of our tools. A lot of these techniques and technologies are being thrust upon us whether we want them or not. So some of the tools that we would use in our everyday kind of processing of information are going to certainly rely more heavily on these kinds of techniques. And so we need to be very aware of of how our tools work and how they do what they do, and ensure that they are providing us with results that are not algorithmically biased. There is a lot of promise, I suppose, for some AI-based approaches. There's definitely promise to highly computational approaches, but we need to think very, very carefully about the transparency of our methods. I've said throughout that we need to be very, very explicit about the assumptions we're making, and about the tools we're using, and about the processes we've kind of adopted, and about the ethical choices we've made along the way. You can avoid a lot of the potential downfall of tools and techniques if you are very explicit about what you do. Unfortunately, many of the LLM-based tools, and I presume ongoing emergence of different kinds of AI-based approaches, are going to make that explicitness much more difficult to achieve. And so we need to be very careful about that as a possibility. If we're going to use it, we have to be especially reflective of its use. We should be reflective of all of our techniques, but AI requires us to be vigilant as to the possibility of bias being introduced into the process. And so, this brings us to the final piece here, which is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Even though there have been dramatic changes in the ways in which we acquire data and analyze it, and the tools that we have at hand, a lot of the pieces remain the same. We still need to we still have to kind of engage in thoughtful operationalization. We still need to be, if we are sampling, we need to consider how we're doing that sampling. Or even if it's not sampling for inference, if we're choosing cases or choosing sites for our research, we need to be thoughtful about not just choosing what's convenient, but choosing what is most effective to answer our research questions. We have to be reflexive throughout this process and explicit about what we're doing. We have to have historical awareness and cultural awareness and social awareness about the context in which we're doing research. All of these things were true before big data. All of them are true after the incredible turn towards datafication. And so that remains the same. Datafication changes and transforms our methods, but it does not absolve us from some of the responsibilities that we had before. And if anything, it just is more for us to take on as we engage in this world.